another quick film tonight. I think I said that last time and waffled on for about half an hour, so I'll try and make this one quicker. I've done a few little bits and pieces. One, something I did wrong quite a while ago, which was these are the front brake cams, and these come with a stainless steel bushing on here. And I thought those needed to be removed and replaced, and it turns out they were actually quite hard to get off. They're a very tight push fit, so I ended up cutting off the old ones. Don't do that. Apparently, you're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to be on there and stuck on there. Luckily, I had two sets of them, so I do have a set that I can use. I may end up, if I really need to, I could always machine up a new set, but these basically fit into the front brake back shells like that. It's about hard with one hand, but this is the cam that operates the brake shoes, and there's a lever that goes on here. So it's kind of interesting that this bearing surface, if I can lay this down, inside here is just a stainless steel sleeve on this cam rubbing in the aluminium housing, which seems odd, but that seems to be the way they've done it. I don't know what happens about wear in there. I'm pretty sure somebody's told me they bore these out and fit a bush into them. I'm not sure. I'll have to find out about that. But that was fixing up a mistake I made quite some time ago because I didn't know what I was doing. So we can put those aside. Tonight I cleaned up the rear springs. I did the same thing that I ended up doing on the front springs, which is I added an extra leaf back in. So I don't know what's gone wrong with my fancy spreadsheet that you use to calculate all of this, but what I ended up with the springs didn't seem to match what was in the spreadsheet. So there's some value in there that's not quite right, or something I'm missing. But what I found was with the correct number of springs, according to the spreadsheet, and also according to how many springs a real Brookland had, how many leaves, they seem way too soft. So, for example, if I stood on one, just with it flat on the ground like this, it would just flatten completely. So that didn't seem right to me. So I've ended up putting in an extra leaf for now. If that ends up being too hard, then it's easy to take it out again. But I'd rather have it too hard and too arched to start with than putting them on the car, getting everything on the car, and then putting the car down on the ground on its wheels and having the springs go upside down. They're supposed to be flat. When the car's sitting at nominal weight, the springs are supposed to be completely level. So I've added that extra leaf back in, which makes a big difference. And the other thing I had to do was remake this middle pin the same as on the fronts. The spring makers had just put a bolt through there. It might have been the one that actually came with the springs. But the way these rear springs work is you have these trunnions which go around the axle. So this actually fits down in there and clamps around the rear axle tube. And it doesn't clamp it tight. The rear axle actually has to be able to rotate inside this because of the way the rear suspension on the Riley works. So this trunnion block has a locating hole in the bottom of it. And if I can get this to stand up, that little locating hole fits on to that pin like that. Once all this is bolted together, these springs do get stiffer because the length of them effectively gets shorter because you've clamped this middle piece, and so this middle piece doesn't move. So that does increase the stiffness of the springs, but you can see that'll... well, you would see if I could get it to actually go together. That goes down through there, and I'm not sure what goes on the bottom actually. Maybe there must be a flat plate or 2 short flat plates. I need to actually look that up because obviously I'm missing that piece. So once all of this is assembled, something like that. These are mounting points for the shocks, so that will fit on there like that. There we go. These are quite heavy, so it is difficult to do it one-handed. Well, you get the idea. Those should come down and then you fit whatever goes on the bottom there. I suspect it's just a plate. So the next thing is the mounting points for the shackles at the front and the rear. Sorry, that's the front. That's the rear off the springs. You can see one eye wraps down and one eye wraps up. So the one that goes up is at the back. So I need to next look at, there's basically a pin that comes out the end of that tube, which is the rear shackle mount, and there's a plate with a pin that comes out of it, which will be on a slight angle, because if you look at the chassis here, the chassis rail's on an angle, so the pin has to come out straight for the front shackle. So the spring is held on shackles at either end. So the whole spring moves on its shackles, but the rear axle is held in place because of the torque tube. So there's the torque tube there, and it pivots at that point on the back of the gearbox around the brake mechanism. So it's an interesting setup. The other small job I did a couple of nights ago, last night, I can't remember, was because I'm going to be needing to make up various pins and bits and pieces. This is 20mm high tensile steel. This is what I use to make the stud that holds the back of the gearbox, that ball joint to the cross member. And this little lathe, which is an Emcomat 7, supposedly has a 20mm spindle bore, but it turns out this wouldn't fit through the bore. So it would get so far in and then stop. And the spindle here is threaded, so the chuck threads off. This is a locking collar, and it's actually got a taper on it as well. So I think it's an MT3 taper. What I found is the taper comes down, and then you've got the rest of the spindle bore, and there was a little step where the two met, and that was stopping anything that was 20mm going all the way through. It was very, very tiny, the step. It was just enough to stop something going through. So what I ended up having to do, very, very carefully, was take the chuck off, and I actually used an extension on my Dremel with a little grinding wheel, and I was able to reach that down inside the spindle while the lathe was going and just grind off that step. I had to be really, really careful I didn't touch the taper going in or out, because you don't want to damage the taper, so I managed to do that. The extension cable thing I used on the Dremel eventually broke. The spring drive inside it snapped, but luckily I had just ground out enough to get, we put this through, get the 20mm one all the way through. This piece of plastic that I have, some sort of engineering plastic, is also supposedly 20mm diameter. This won't fit through. That still gets stuck on the step about there. But because my Dremel broke, I can't grind it anymore, and probably I shouldn't anyway. I don't want to risk damaging anything. So the good thing is now I can put long bars, 20mm bars all the way through, which is big enough for a lot of things, but you're bound to need to machine something that's sort of 22mm, of course, because whatever lathe you've got is never quite big enough. But you can see this one won't go through, gets stuck. The other problem was the chuck itself. So even though the back of the chuck has a 20mm diameter hole, the front of it here was slightly smaller. So this is a proper MCO chuck, so it should have a 20mm diameter hole, but it was too small. So again, the bar wouldn't actually fit through the chuck. So I ended up having to machine the chuck itself. So normally you try to avoid running the tools into the chuck. In this case, I actually took the jaws out and bored it out. So I don't know if this was a 3/4 inch one or something like that, so just slightly smaller than 20mm, but 20mm bar wouldn't fit through there either. So this was really easy to machine. It's not, didn't seem to be hardened or anything. It just machined no problem. And I think that was about it for this update. So these have been sitting in the evaporust, which is still doing its job. So it's taken all the rust out of the casting. It's quite hard to clean these castings sometimes because of the rough surface. So that evaporust stuff just gets straight in there and really cleans them up. And the springs will need painting as well as those ball joint ends. So I'm just waiting for a nice day before I can do all that. The springs have been coated in Penetrol anti-rust paint prep stuff, which seeps into all the gaps. So it soaks in between the leaves really nicely and should lubricate those a bit. Stop them rusting, hopefully. But I think that's it for tonight. I got them to fit. I looked in the parts book to see if I can see what goes underneath there, but the parts book I've got is for a slightly different car and it's not set up the same way, so it's different. The other thing I forgot to mention is I made the little spacer tubes that go at the top of the springs on these little clips, and I had this piece of tube to make them from, and these springs are 50mm wide across the top, basically 2 inch, and of course this piece of tube was just fractionally too short. So this is always a problem when you're just doing this kind of as a hobby like I am, and you don't have easy access to all these bits of steel and offcuts and things like that. You treasure every single little offcut, and you're always reluctant to actually use them for anything and cut them up because you think, oh, but I might need that later. So this is a case where I had this piece and I've obviously chopped bits off it in the past, and now it's just too short for that job. But luckily I found another length of it in my little scrap bin.